What's your reaction to what Mr. Bloomberg has said?
Well, look, obviously he's a significant investor in London, so he's as entitled as anybody to have a view. But I think what his comments show is that actually fundamentally he doesn't understand the nature of the UK economy, and he is so totally wrong on his comments about immigration. I mean, I'm really astonished that someone as smart as that cannot differentiate between immigration and uncontrolled immigration across the UK that's led to what we've got, which is zero real wage growth over the last decade. And, I mean, that is just a basic economic fact. I think the other point...
Well, when you say that's a basic fact, here's another basic fact from his point of view. He employs 4,000 people.
Indeed.
And this and Brexit has affected his decision-making about investing in this country.
And I'm afraid I just don't believe him there, because the truth is, when he made that investment decision to build another 1.1 million square feet office building, he knew that Brexit was right at the top of the agenda. He knew there was going to be a referendum, and he confirmed only this week that actually he's built that building so that they can employ thousands of more people. And the truth is, London's competition is not from the rest of the EU in terms of the City of London. It's from Hong Kong, it's from New York. And London has so much great expertise, and so many people who work for Bloomberg. The truth is, they don't want to go and live in Luxembourg or Frankfurt or Dublin. Their wives don't, their children don't. They can't go to schools, the hospitals, and the housing. And that's why the City of London will still remain the greatest financial centre in the world.
How important is it for people like you that you continue to make the argument about what being outside the EU can look like, particularly when, yes, there was a clear win for the Leave campaign in the referendum, but there's clearly a lot of people who still need convincing that Britain can have a bright future outside the EU?
Well, you're right. We still have to make the case, because there are far too many people within the Westminster establishment who want to either delay it, dilute it or deny it. And that's why our campaign, Leave Means Leave, continues to make that case and to make the case as to how the negotiations should be handled, because in reality, the government has made some significant mistakes in its negotiating tactics.
What are the mistakes, do you think?
So it's made almost every classic mistake in the negotiating rulebook. It hasn't set out a credible plan B, which is WTO, which is absolutely fine as a base case. It hasn't published that. The EU doesn't believe we're prepared to go it. It hasn't set a deadline for when it needs to make that decision. It hasn't employed top private sector negotiators to help advise it. So, and it's tried to call the EU's bluff, and then it's withdrawn. And that's the reason why at the moment people feel that the EU is on the front foot and we're on the back foot.
You sound like you think that they're making a complete hash of it.
Well, it's pretty clear to everybody that, actually, whilst obviously the negotiations were going to get difficult, the truth is that it's taking too long and we've made some significant errors along the way. We should never have allowed this sequential process. We should never have allowed it to be 1 week's negotiating in 3 or 4. In the world of business, this would have been done and dusted in 3 months. We'd have been negotiating 24/7, and we would have set a very clear deadline with a very clear, credible walk-away plan and set out what the plan B is.
So when you heard Sir Ivan Rogers, formerly Britain's man in Brussels as the ambassador to the EU, saying yesterday in Parliament that he thought that Britain had been screwed, to use his word, in the negotiation by not setting out at the start, before triggering Article 50, before starting the clock ticking, if you like, and having a row that at that point said, look, we will trigger this process, but only when you agree that we can talk about the future as well as the past, unravelling the current relationship as well as planning the future one at the same time. You'd agree with him, would you, that that was a big mistake on Britain's part?
I agree with elements of it, but we had to trigger Article 50 in order to start the clock ticking so that the EU believed and understood that we are leaving, and to start to put some pressure on them. But where he's right is what we haven't set out is a clear deadline that works for us. And I'm afraid the suggestion yesterday from David Davis that we could wait until literally the last minute of the 11th hour in March 2019 is just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. There's no incentive then for the EU to sign anything. They'll just drag us into a long transition period, which will turn into a long permanent transition period, where we become a new Brexit member of the European Union. So I've got serious criticisms about the pace and the way that this negotiation is being conducted.
Just before we move on, Richard, just coming back, do you want to come back on what Ali was saying there?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Prime Minister's made it very clear what we do want, which is a free trade agreement, a special relationship, but we're leaving the single market and the customs union. It actually couldn't be clearer. But the reality is, where we agree is that this process needs to be accelerated. Every negotiator knows that unless you're prepared to walk away, you will end up with a bad deal. No deal is always better than a bad deal, and that's why the government's got to publish and set out and give confidence to businesses, consumers and the public alike that actually WTO, which is a different type of deal, is absolutely fine as a base case scenario. After all, it's what other great nations like the US, Canada, Australia all operate under. If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us.
Not quite, actually. Most other countries deal with the EU on the basis of other trade agreements, technical agreements.
A mutual recognition agreement, exactly. And that's why we've got to allow ourselves time by saying we're going to WTO much earlier so that we have time to put in place those technical arrangements that would be required.
That is a deal. That's not no deal. Those are trade deals.
Well, I hope you're listening, because that's what I just said. I said it's a different type of deal.